I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
Thank you to everybody who is here already. BookShop West Portal is so grateful to Wonderfest. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really pleased to be able to continue this partnership with Wonderfest and bring to you some really fascinating authors and speakers. Today, we are so grateful to have Dr. Andy Clark. Without further ado, Tucker and Dr. Andy Clark.
All right. Thank you, Lillian. My name is indeed Tucker Hiatt. I'm the founding director of Wonderfest, the Bay Area beacon of science. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce philosopher and author, Dr. Andy Clark. Dr. Clark is professor of cognitive philosophy at England's University of Sussex, where he is Zooming with us right now. Previously, Dr. Clark was director of the cognitive science program at Indiana University and director of the philosophy, neuroscience, psychology program, that's a 3-for-1, at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Clark's numerous books include Surfing Uncertainty, Supersizing the Mind, Natural Born Cyborgs, and Being There, Putting Brain, Body, and World Together Again. His latest work, about which we'll learn today, is The Experience Machine: How Minds Predict and Shape Reality. Please welcome cognitive philosopher and prolific author, Dr. Andy Clark.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay, well, it's lovely to be here. The plan of action from me is to read the preface to the book. It's only a few pages long, and then to make some general comments, offer a little demo, and then we'll do some Q&A. So it's a pretty straightforward plan. Okay, here we go. So, shaping experience. This is the preface. A few years ago, I was invited to speak at a popular science festival in London. I'm a professor of cognitive philosophy, an odd title that reflects a rather eclectic set of interests, spanning philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and artificial intelligence. I was about to give a talk on one of my favorite topics, the human brain as a prediction machine. The festival, run by a popular science magazine, was called New Scientist Live, and it was held in the huge Excel Centre in London's Docklands. I'm not really a stranger to public speaking, but standing backstage at this huge auditorium and thinking about the packed audience behind the curtain, I couldn't help but get the jitters. Maybe I should have made some last-minute changes to my slides. Maybe I should have worn a less startling shirt. So I didn't learn that lesson, did I? Was there someone I forgot to thank? Suddenly, my anxious train of thought was interrupted by my phone buzzing in my pocket. But my phone was not in my pocket. As I quickly remembered, not only had I removed it and placed it under the podium, I'd also set it safely on airplane mode for the entire event. But buzzing I felt, and clear, strong buzzing too. What I experienced was a common trick of the mind, now got its own name, phantom vibration syndrome. Given that I'm a chronic long-term phone user, my brain has slowly come to expect the frequent intrusion of pocket buzz, and I'm not the only one. A 2012 study found that 89% of college undergrads reported feeling phantom phone vibrations. It's also particularly prevalent among medical interns, where fake buzzing is strongly associated with stress. It was perhaps fitting that those phantom vibrations should intrude just as I was about to launch my presentation. For although such phenomena are well known within psychology and neuroscience, they now fall into place as part of a much grander theory, one that I've been helping construct along with many others for the past decade. According to that overarching theory, the topic of the talk, and indeed of this book, phantom vibrations are just one vivid demonstration of the way all human experience is built. According to what's become known as predictive processing, reality as we experience it is built from our own predictions. It was my habitual expectation of pocket buzz that, combined with the stress of the occasion, created a clear buzzing sensation out of whole cloth. Predictive processing speaks to one of the most challenging questions in science and philosophy, the nature of the relationship between mind and reality. Contrary to the standard belief that our senses are a kind of passive window onto the world, what's emerging is a picture of an ever-active brain, one that's always trying to predict what the world might currently have to offer. Nothing that we do or experience, if this story is on track, is untouched by these predictions. Instead, there's a constant give and take in which what we experience reflects not just what the world is currently telling us, but what we, consciously or mostly non-consciously, were expecting it to be telling us. One consequence of this is that we're never simply seeing what's really there, stripped bare of our own anticipations or insulated from our own idiosyncratic past experiences. Instead, all human experience is part phantom, the product of deep-set predictions. We can no more experience the world prediction and expectation free than we could surf without a wave. When I stood backstage at that festival, the stress of waiting to give my presentation sent my prediction machinery into overdrive. Given my lifetime experience, I didn't expect the floor to suddenly turn to jelly underneath me or an anvil to fall cartoon-like on my head. But my phone does vibrate in my pocket annoyingly often, causing my brain to form a kind of baseline prediction of frequent vibrations. It's actually a bit like chronic pain, and I'll come back to that in the remarks later. Stress and caffeine, I'd had plenty of both, tend to amplify such effects. And signals from an anxious gut also feed directly into the prediction machinery in our heads. When all those factors came together, that baseline prediction of probable pocket buzzing briefly became my reality. The illusion occurred because predictive brains are guessing machines, proactively anticipating signals from the body and the surrounding world. But guessing is only as good as the assumptions it makes, and even a well-informed best guess will frequently miss the mark. There was no phone in my pocket. When the brain's best guessing misses the mark, the mismatch with the actual sensory signal delivers new information. That information, the so-called prediction error signal, can be used to try again, to make a better guess at how things really are. This, of course, doesn't always work. Sometimes we're fooled. We'll come back to that later too. But whatever the circumstance, experience always and everywhere reflects the brain's best current guessing. This challenges a once traditional picture of perception, where sensory information was often considered to be the starting point of experience. The science of the predictive brain suggests a different role. Now, the current sensory signal is used to refine and correct the process of informed guessing, the attempts at prediction, that's already taken place. In these models, it's the predictions that do much of the heavy lifting. According to this picture, our experience of the world, of ourselves, and of our own bodies is never a simple reflection of external or internal facts. Instead, all human experience arises at the meeting point of informed prediction and sensory stimulation. This is a significant change. For much of human history, scientists and philosophers saw perception as a process that worked mostly from the outside in, as light, sound, touch, and chemical odors activated receptors in eyes, ears, nose, and skin, progressively being refined into a richer picture of the wider world. Even into the 21st century, leading models in neuroscience and artificial intelligence retained core elements of that view. So, you know, I'm thinking David Marr, feed-forward picture of visual processing there. Predictive processing flips that traditional story on its head. Perception is now heavily shaped from the opposite direction. Predictions formed deep in the brain are reaching down to alter responses all the way to areas closer to the skin, eyes, nose, and ears, the sensory organs taking in signals from the external world. What we perceive today is thus deeply rooted in what we experienced yesterday and all the days before that. Every aspect of our daily experience comes to us filtered by hidden webs of prediction, the brain's best expectations rooted in our own past histories. To see just how important this could be, imagine a world in which the weather forecast played a significant role in causing, not simply predicting the weather itself. In that strange world, a confident forecast of rain helps bring about changes to the flows of matter and energy that determine the change in weather. There, a confident forecast of rain has causal powers that make rain itself a little more likely. There, as here, the weather forecast depends on a model, never perfect, of the way existing weather conditions are most likely to change and evolve over time. But in that world, the weather you get here and now reflects a kind of combination of the effects of the prior forecast and the pre-existing conditions out in the world. We don't live in that bizarre world. The weather we get is not affected by our best model-based predictions of that weather. But our mental world shares something of that profile. When the brain strongly predicts a certain sight, a sound, or a feeling, that prediction plays a role in shaping what we seem to see, hear, or feel. Emotion, mood, and even planning all turn out to be based in predictions too. Depression, anxiety, and fatigue all reflect alterations to the hidden predictions shaping our experience. Alter those predictions, for example, by simply reframing a situation using different words, and our experience itself can alter. Consider the prickly rush of adrenaline I felt just before going on stage to deliver that speech, or tonight for that matter. I practiced attending to that prickly feeling while verbally reframing it, not as a portent of failure, but as a sign of my own chemical readiness to deliver a good performance. This helps alter my self-predictions, leading to a more relaxed and fluent performance. You know, you don't know what this will be like without that. The book explores many such interventions, stressing both their surprising scope and their undoubted limits. It looks at experiences of the body and self, from chronic pain to psychosis, and how work on the predictive brain can explain a wide variety of human biases, human behaviors, and neurodiversity. I also look, because this is one of my own sort of pet subjects, at how predictive brains can support extended minds, how they can blur the boundaries between ourselves and our best fitted tools and environments. The book ends by putting key insights into action, looking at ways to hack the predictive mind by changing our practices, reframing our experiences using different kinds of language, or by the controlled use of psychedelic drugs. As these themes converge, we glimpse the shape of a new and more deeply unified science of the mind, one that does justice to the range and the diversity of human experience, and that I think may have real implications for how to think about ourselves and improve our lives. That's the end of the preface. So thanks for listening to that. There we are. There's the book, the nice yellow American cover. Got to be said, I love that cover better than the European cover. Don't tell my European editors. Right. So here's the plan. I'm going to rehearse the picture, but this time with some demos and examples. I'm going to pull out a few of those implications for psychiatry and neurology. One of those implications is actually that the distinction between psychology and neurology, I think, is one that we're going to end up losing. And also say why I think it matters. What do we really stand to gain if these models are on track? So, okay, I'll make sure that I don't run over time. So let's get that going. Yeah. Okay, so predictive processing, the kind of the theory that's at the root of everything in the book. The idea, as we were saying in the preface there, is that brains are multi-level, multi-area prediction machines. What that really means is that what you experience, not just in the world, but in your own body too, is always a combination of what your brain was predicting and the incoming waves of sensory evidence. So, you know, sensory evidence isn't itself experienced in a raw way. It's experienced only through this lens of prediction. So if I show you this, it probably won't look like much of anything to you, but let me now improve your abilities to engage in a bit of prediction. So now you can see it's kind of the head of a cow or a bull, or a cow, I guess, a cow looking at you. And now I'll show you the original one again. So now your brain's in command of a much better set of predictions and can sort of carve up and make sense of that scene better. I think this is what brains are doing all the time. Of course, you still need to be anchored to the world. It's not all just about what you predict. And the anchors to the world are these prediction error signals. They're residual error signals that carry real information. They basically carry whatever information wasn't currently explained by the attempt at prediction. So those signals are kind of used very, very rapidly to try to retrieve a better prediction. And if they can't retrieve a better prediction, then they have to drive slow, long-term learning. In the case of the cow, you had good predictions already in shape, so retrieval was pretty easy. So the idea is predictions and prediction error signals are really rapidly formed and exchanged. We don't catch ourselves in the act of making predictions or responding to errors. It just seems like you open your eyes and you see the world. So there are echoes here of quite a lot of stuff that some of you will be very familiar with. Echoes of Kant, most strongly echoes of Helmholtz, also echoes of Neisser, Gregory, many, many others. The idea common to all of these is that perceptions of the world aren't passive reflections, but active constructions. They're things that we build in context in ways informed by stored knowledge. So there's a kind of Bayesian reading of all this stuff too. We can talk about that in discussion if we want to. So how are predictions possible? Well, they become possible because the brain is a statistically sensitive organ that learns a generative model of the world. So it's worth pausing to say what a generative model is. Many of you will know. It's a structured knowledge store that can actually construct a plausible version of the data it's been trained on for itself, using what it's learned about patterns in the training data. So, for example, generative models lie behind all those headline-grabbing applications like the large language models, ChatGPT and the others. ChatGPT learns to predict patterns in successor word space. Midjourney, for example, learned about patterns in a natural language description to image space. But in human and animal brains, this is going on in many, many different ways and across many, many different timescales. So the idea there is that multiple kinds of information are accumulated over many interacting timescales, and they're supposed to simultaneously inform the top-down construction, prediction of the sensory signal. Information about how looks predict tastes, for example, about the inner states of our own biological bodies, about how stuff unfolds on multiple timescales, and I think crucially, about how our own actions like swilling and sniffing the wine in the glass will alter what we see, taste, and hear, and so on. So all these multimodal, multi-timescale action involving predictions have to settle into a coherent whole that best accounts for the current waves of raw sensory information. And I think that's what we experience as understanding. That's what it is to understand the world as you encounter it in perception and as you engage it by action. Right. This recalls a slogan that some of you will have come across. I don't really know who did this, came up with this slogan first. I think it was probably Max Klaus, the early machine learning theorist, machine vision theorist. But the phrase is that perception is a kind of controlled hallucination. Your brain's trying to guess what's out there, and to the extent that the guess matches, some people say explains away, the incoming sensory data, you get to perceive the world. The same process can mislead. Here's the hollow mask illusion. This is a joke shop mask there, just being turned around. If you were standing about 8 foot away from that and it was lit from behind, as it turns and the concave side comes to face you, you actually see it as convex with a nose sticking outwards. But in fact, that's the concave side. What's going on there? It seems to be that we have a very, very strong prediction of convexity for faces. Noses stick outwards, not inwards. And in this case, this is trumping bits of the real sensory input. So there's good sensory information there specifying concavity, but it's being treated as just uninformative noise due to that very, very strong unconscious convexity expectation. You can see why this is Bjorn Borg, the tennis player, another one there. You can see why they do this mostly with famous faces. I've got an Einstein mask that is like this as well. It's because you know those faces even better. And so the effect is the illusion is even stronger in those cases. If you turn the mask upside down, for example, the illusion is weakened. So as another way of showing what a difference apt prediction can make to perception, I'm going to play a couple of clips of sine wave speech. These are sort of degraded replicas of ordinary speech, where they've taken out a lot of the usual auditory information. So what you'll hear will sound like a set of pure tone whistles. If the slide here is probably more for the UK audience, but there was an old children's TV show called The Clangers that was rather popular at one time, and they spoke a bit like this, sort of. So that's kind of what it sounds like to begin with. But then we'll play you the original sound file, and then we'll play the sine wave speech, the degraded sound file again. And what you will probably hear, what most people hear, is that the second time around, the degraded sound file sounds remarkably different. There we go. There's a motorbike outside my window there. Hope you can't hear it.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
It was a sunny day and the children were going to the park.
So what I want you to appreciate there is the first time you heard that, it probably didn't sound like much. Then we improve your brain's ability to make good predictions. Then we play you that sound file again. And this time around, suddenly it should sound remarkably different. And you'll never be able to hear that particular sample of sine wave speech the way you heard it the first time around again. For example, after years of doing this stuff, I'm a native speaker of sine wave speech now, so I don't need to hear the original sound files. And there are some people that don't either. So there is individual variation here. I'll play a couple more.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo.
The camel was kept in a cage at the zoo. He was sitting at his desk in his office.
He was sitting at his desk in his office.
He was sitting at his desk in his office. The police returned to the museum.
The police returned to the museum.
The police returned to the museum.
So the idea there is that's just supposed to be a quick way of showing what a huge difference to experience apt top-down prediction can make. So, okay, the small print, before going on to some of the implications, you know, there's good evidence for this story. It's computationally feasible. There are lots of little proofs by simulation. It makes sense of a huge amount of experimental findings. And there are increasingly detailed proposals for how to implement it in the brain. So in effect, it sort of hits all three of David Marr's famous levels of explanation. You know, there's a good in principle story, there are algorithms that will implement it, and there's an account of how the brain gets to implement the algorithms. So for a good look at the current state of the evidence, there's a couple of places you can go. The Walsh et al. Paper that I was involved in, and a recent book called Active Inference, the Free Energy Principle. Good summaries of the evidence. One of my personal favorite little tiny snippets of evidence is that we're just so good at spotting things that aren't there. So think about, for example, the profile of neuronal responses to an emitted tone. If you sort of set up some expectations for a tone, sort of da da da, and then I go da da, and I emit the tone, then at the very instant in which the tone would have started, your brain starts to behave in the kind of way it would be behaving were the tone present. And then, of course, you get prediction error signals because the tone's not actually present there. So you get another spike signaling the emission. I think this is sort of phenomenologically interesting. You know, when we hear something that's missing, it has a very specific character. It's that thing that's missing, not something else. And I think only these predictive processing stories do justice to that kind of fact and phenomenology. Emission responses are impossible without predictions. And these emissions have a very, very distinctive qualitative character. It's a sense of the absence of that tone, not just any old tone. Another little bit of sort of evidence, I suppose, just at least somewhere where we encounter this in ordinary experience. Think about listening to a song you know very well when you're in the shower. The song that you know very well is going to sound an awful lot clearer than one that you don't know well. Again, because your brain's making better predictions. This is actually changing your perceptual experience. It's not like a sort of memory effect that is getting added in later. So the bold unifying claim is that this is a fundamental operating principle of the brain. Generative model-based predictions meet the sensory evidence in ways adjusted by something called precision, and experience emerges. So if we're going to really do the whole story, we'd want to look at the PP account of action, the predictive processing account of action too. But that's a whole extra dimension, so I'm not going to try it in these quick remarks. It's done at length in the book. Another thing that's done at length in the book that I'm not going to talk about here is the way predictive brains breed cyborg or extended minds. They do this roughly because they're good at selecting actions that will minimize uncertainty as we go about our goals, that will minimize future uncertainty. But again, we can talk about that in discussion if anyone wants to. So the promised applications to psychiatry and neurology. So this, for me, this is where a lot of the most exciting things are happening. But in order to see how they work, we need one last little bit of technical apparatus. And this is that thing I mentioned a minute ago, the precision weighting operation. So in predictive processing, the balance between your brain's top-down predictions and the incoming sensory evidence is never fixed. Instead, the brain also has to estimate, moment by moment, how much and at every level of processing to weight the current sensory evidence against the current predictions as kind of guessing that you're making based on prior experience. So precision estimations are the brain's way of telling itself where and by how much amongst all its prior knowledge and all the present sensory stimulation to place its bets. It's estimating what's reliable and what isn't. Now, if that goes wrong, if the precision estimation mechanism goes wrong, then you'll misestimate what to take seriously and what not to take seriously. It'll be like the neural equivalent of fake news. And so variations in these precision weighted balancing acts are kind of being explored as a way of understanding all kinds of things in psychiatry and cognitive neuroscience more generally. So, for example, those phantom phone vibrations that I was talking about in the preface increase with stress and caffeine. What they're doing is acting on brain biochemistry, especially stuff involving dopamine and other neurotransmitters. And it's those neurotransmitter economies that determine how your brain is balancing its predictions against the incoming sensory signal. And there's two ways that balancing act, that core balancing act, can go wrong. The first is to overweight the sensory evidence. If you do that, then you're underweighting your own model-based guesses relative to the sensory signal. What that would do is it would make it very hard for you to detect faint patterns in a noisy or ambiguous environment. You're giving extra weight to the sensory evidence rather than the model that you may have. And it increasingly looks as if autism spectrum condition involves just this kind of altered balance. In effect, enhancing all the detail in the incoming sensory stream and making it seem full of unexplained details and hard to master. So the picture there is a kind of enhanced sensory processing effect at the heart of autism spectrum condition. So it's quite different in that sense to the other accounts. So what happens if the precision weighted balancing act goes the other way? Suppose you assign too little precision to low level sensory evidence. In that case, you're overweighting your own predictions. Obviously, if you weight your own predictions highly enough, you'll start to hallucinate patterns that aren't there, just because at some level your brain strongly expects them. That's what was going on in the phantom phone vibration case, and indeed in the hollow mask case. So in all those cases, our own strong hidden sensory expectations become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So there's a case that illustrates this well. It's from the British Medical Journal, a construction worker in the USA who fell off some scaffolding and landed on a 15-centimeter nail. So the construction worker was in extreme pain. He was taken to hospital. They gave him fentanyl to enable them to remove the nail from the boot. But when they did that, it turned out that the nail had passed completely safely between his toes. So there was no damage to the foot, but the construction worker was getting strong visual evidence of serious damage. And I have no doubt that that was causing genuine excruciating pain. Pain that indeed, I'm sure, was relieved when the fentanyl was given to them, because again, that would activate strong expectations of relief as well as all its other effects. Even placebo fentanyl would have had some effect. So dramatic cases, similarly dramatic cases, involve what's known as placebo analgesia. In some patients, placebo interventions can reduce experienced pain to the same extent as a strong opioid. And even honest placebos work. And I think this is a very interesting case that you spend some time on in the book. So if someone tells you this is a placebo drug you're being given, it's got no active ingredients, many people still experience good effects and relief. And this seems to be because it's not what you consciously expect to experience that are kind of the most important predictions here. There's a sort of huge iceberg of unconscious prediction machinery that is getting activated by stuff like good packaging and presentation by authoritative sounding people in white coats and so on. And so it's that unconscious huge amount of prediction machinery that gets activated, even if you, as a conscious agent, would just stand there and say, yeah, you know, I'm not really expecting any relief because I know there's no active ingredient here. So yeah, conscious agentive prediction, what you think you currently predict, is just the tip of this iceberg. Okay, saying that. I think another thing that I do want to say here is that these unusual cases, and there's quite a lot of them in the book, like construction worker and cases of functional, what used to be called psychogenic medical disorders, where there's no standard physical cause, but people experience genuine pain, blindness, paralysis. Those kind of exotic cases are constructed in just the same way and from just the same basic elements as ordinary daily perception. All that's different are the details of this precision-weighted balancing act. So even ordinary pain, pain with a clear, standard structural cause, behaves really differently across time and context, both in a single patient and across multiple patients. And what it looks like is that these differences, at least in part, reflect the influence of learned expectations too. It's been shown for work on experienced breathlessness in asthma, for experienced pain and disability in people with atrial fibrillation, diabetes, and many more. So what's interesting there for me is that there's this sort of deep continuity between typical and atypical forms of experience. And I think seeing that continuity is one of the sort of positive takeaway messages of the book. Another of the positive takeaways, I think, is that expectations and associated patterns of attention always matter. I think this makes room for a sort of evidence-based use of stuff like suggestion, ritual, empathy, and holistic therapy. All this has social and political implications as well. There's some work here by Professor Lisa Feldman-Barrett, who has suggested that misfiring predictions could be at work in some cases of shooter bias, cases where a non-threatening item like a cell phone, sadly, especially when held by a Black person, is mistakenly seen as a weapon. In those cases, Feldman-Barrett argues, there's probably a toxic combination of hidden racially biased expectations and bodily information that's usually suggestive of danger, the officer's own rapidly beating heart. That could potentially create a false, fleeting visual impression. So you kind of seem to be seeing a gun. Biased perceiving is a key vulnerability of the predictive brain, I think. So the point there is it's not just biased judging. You know, the predictions can reach down with enough power to change what you seem to be seeing. Another vulnerability of the predictive brain is its tendency to get locked into vicious circles of self-prediction. So for example, in depression, your brain might be busy predicting, oh, things aren't going to go well, no matter what turn, no matter what I do, no matter what I try. And this will distort social interactions, but then seem to confirm the unhelpful expectation, and so on, round and round. Expected levels of pain alter pain experience. And of course, that can happen in a way that then seems to confirm what might have been a distorted earlier prediction, again locking in the cycle. There are some controlled experiments showing this, the Jetma paper there. So the idea there is, if you predict intense pain, then you're probably going to feel the procedure as more painful than it would have felt otherwise, which seems to confirm your prediction. But actually, there's a sort of false confirmation going on there. So there's an upside to that, because you can then try and push back against some of these things by altering your own subterranean predictions, by hacking the predictive mind. Placebos clearly do this. So can just talking and thinking about things in different ways, reframing our own sensations of pain and disability. Just like, when the dentist says, oh, it's just going to be a little tickle. That can alter the way you experience the event. And that in turn will help confirm the expectation so that the effect persists. So pain reprocessing therapy is actually kind of trying to do this in a more systematic way. The idea is to teach us to reframe certain kinds of chronic pain, especially back pain and so on, as a misfiring pain signal rather than a sign of imminent damage. Not a sign that we should be avoiding doing the things that lead to the pain. That's a sort of natural interpretation of pain. We can't help but think, if it hurts, I shouldn't be doing it. But in some of these cases, if it's a pain signaling system that's going wrong, then you want to push back against that. And you can do that by just being told that this is a misfiring pain signal. That can alter your expectations about how far you can safely go. And as you do a little bit more, that creates a helpful circle of self-expectation, and in many cases, reduces experienced pain. There's actually a pretty okay movie about this stuff called This Might Hurt, which you can check out. So other hacks I look at in the book include meditation, self-affirmation, the controlled use of psychedelic drugs. Idea with the psychedelics is they relax some high-level self-expectations and let us, it's a sort of existence proof that you can experience the world in a different way. So there are all ways of learning to control some of the weightings on predictions, that precision weighted bit of the balancing act, letting us see and experience things, ourselves and the world, in new and helpful ways. So I think that there's a spanning of levels in this work, from the experiential to the computational to the neural and the psychopharmacological, for that matter. That's a kind of striking feature of these accounts. Finally, okay, I'm coming up to the end here. What might we get if these accounts are on the right track? I think that what we might get is a sort of schema that shows just how variations in a very small set of factors, generative model-based predictions, prediction errors, and the precision-weighted balancing acts that they engage in, just how that small set of things got together in these different ways can yield striking differences in experience. There'll be a kind of periodic table of experiential variation, one that spans atypical, neurotypical, and altered states. And that, I think, also speaks to a worry, one that you might very well have, I think, listening to very brief remarks like these. You might have the worry that the predictive processing picture could invite too simple generalizations about psychosis, autism spectrum condition, functional disorders, PTSD, chronic pain, all the things we talk about in the book. My hope, though, is that it will have exactly the opposite effect in the end. That's because these prediction-weighted balancing acts are occurring in every brain area and at every stage of processing. They reflect both our genetic starting points and our unique history of encounters with the world. What that suggests to me is that we're looking here at a very high dimensional space of subtle and not so subtle experiential variations. So, it's going to be a very, very big periodic table. So the hope is that when all this stuff comes together, and when you plug the account of action in as well, and kind of garnish it with the extended mind and how we're going to be driven to become natural born cyborgs, we'll end up with a new way of appreciating both the diversity and perhaps more importantly, the continuity of human experience. Okay, that's the end of the little remarks. I will jump out of the screen share and see what's going on out there. Here we go, jumped out.
Andy, that was terrific. There were so many wonderful, I try not to overuse that word as the Wonderfest big shot. There were so many wonderful ideas in that presentation. Thank you. I take it that to explore them more fully, it'd be wise for folks to buy your book. And I will remind you, you can do that via the BookShop West Portal there, and the first meeting chat comment leads you to that website that allow you to buy the book. Another approach, I guess, would be to watch this video a second time to enjoy its richness. This is being recorded and will be available at the Wonderfest Science YouTube channel, perhaps somewhere else, perhaps via the BookShop West Portal. I'm just not sure of that. Okay, Andy, I have some questions, but again, there's so much. Some of my background is in chemistry, and I was struck by your periodic table. Would you mind taking us back to that slide? Was something other than elements in that table? And I need to know what those other items.
Oh, well, there might well be something that wasn't elements in that slide, because I'm not a chemist. I just pulled that one off the web.
Oh, I thought maybe.
Let's have a look. I think this just shows the danger of pulling something off the web just before you do a talk. Let's have a look. But it's good to get it sorted out, though. Let's have a look. What's on there? I want to know. There we go. Let me fire it up. Ta-da!
Oh, so it is a normal periodic table of elements. I thought maybe you had built a periodic table of experiences or predictions that I see.
I'm afraid that I mean, we could, and there are attempts to sort of generate something a little bit like tables. There's some in that in the Parr and Friston book, actually. So you kind of see how the precision weighted balancing acts are varying for multiple different sorts of ways of being and conditions. But my picture, of course, was just this one, like, let's get something really, really high dimensional and suggest that's really what it's going to look like. So it's, as I said, it's going to be a very big periodic table. But on the other hand, it'll have some central tendencies in it. And so, the central tendencies might conform to stuff that we currently label, like autism spectrum condition or psychosis, or they might not. It might turn out that when we get a mature science like this, the central tendencies actually look different. And that will be closer to a sort of cause-led rather than syndrome-based account. But yeah, let me jump out again from there.
Thank you, Andy. So that if there is such a periodic table someday, it'll be not two-dimensional, beyond three-dimensional, and much larger. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. Yeah. You mentioned a movie that you see somewhat, whose psychology, whose neuroscience, whose philosophy you somewhat acknowledged and certified. It was called This Might Hurt. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Actually, it's just an exploration of mostly of the pain reprocessing kinds of work. And so just showing that, that in many cases, it looks like pushing back against just against the idea that when we feel pain, it's telling us not to do it. That pushing back against that can be helpful, not just because it lets you do more, but then as you do more, you kind of alter your own model of what you're able to do. And that actually seems to reduce experience pain to some extent. So, it's early days for these sorts of intervention. But there's lots of them around. They look interesting. Virtual reality-based interventions have promise as well, particularly for the treatment of pain. So, big kind of soothing virtual landscapes of pulsating jellyfish and things like this seem actually to be very powerful pain relievers. Again, because maybe you're sort of in training these sorts of predictions of certain sorts of soothing, pulsing rhythms. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in the book that I didn't try to bring out here about how interoceptive predictions about the states of our own body are playing a big role in this stuff too. Predictions of thirst are actually rather a nice example. We feel you know, if you take, Lisa Feldman Barrett gives this example, if you take a drink of water, you immediately feel less thirsty, but it's not going to make any difference to the relevant bodily systems for about 20 minutes. So the feeling of having your thirst quenched is sort of evidence of a prediction at work. You now predict it's all going to be okay, and that's how you feel. And that's okay, because the sensation of thirst was also activated in advance, if you like. So you don't wait until you really, really are desperate for water before you start to feel thirsty. Anyway, so interoceptive prediction and sort of energy budgeting is a big bit of these accounts.
I understand. Your publisher kindly provided a galley copy of your book to me, but prior to reading it, I thought the title was leading in a different direction. The initial title, not the subtitle, The Experience Machine, alludes to something that is not a subject of the book as I see it, but rather a subject about which I bet you know a lot. I just must know, when I hear the word machine, I don't automatically think of a human brain, but I understand your characterization of it that way. In turn, though, is there any notion that however advanced the artificial intelligence system is, let's say the GPT series up to GPT-4 now, is there any sense that such artificial intelligence systems, as perhaps we can call them more normally construed machines, that they have any sort of subjective experience?
This is a big question, a very very timely one, isn't it? Yeah, someone actually at the live book launch in Brighton, someone was asking me about the machine bit of the title as well. So interesting there. All I meant by using the word machine there really was, look, I'm just a materialist about this stuff and kind of a computationalist as well. And so it's that sort of it's that kind of sense. But in terms of, you know, what I see as a prospect for the sorts of AI that we're mostly looking at the moment, you know, I think because the generative models are not closing a perception action loop, they're not likely to lead to what I would regard as real understanding or feeling. So, you know, if you're just predicting in word space, for example, you're doing something rather different to forming a generative model whose job is to close perception action loops, in that sense that, you know, I know that if I intervene on the world in certain ways, I'll get certain sensory experiences as a result. And I think it's because we have those abilities to poke and prod and push the world and see what happens, that we actually start to understand the world as a kind of a system of interwoven causes and effects. I don't think that's what our current sort of, or most of the generative AIs are getting, because they're seeing a kind of fossil trail of that in, you know, patterns in word space or patterns in pixel space. So they can't, it's almost as if you had a huge library of experimental results, but you couldn't conduct a new experiment. You just couldn't do an experiment. So, you know, maybe when that starts to alter a bit, then I might start to think that we were a little bit more on the road to something that might be worth worrying about in terms of sentience.
Wow.
In terms of course, being a wonderful tool, the current ones are amazing tools, and I think that they're going to be a great part of our cyborg future in that respect.
I'm now going to have to read your earlier book about what is the full title? The cyborg?
Natural born cyborg.
Natural born cyborg. Yes.
That's it. It's just like, yeah, we humans are very, very prone to this stuff, and you know, and I actually think that the predictive brain story shows what kind of platform you need to develop cyborg minds. But yeah, that's
all right. Thank you. I see not a raised hand here.
no, I don't know what did I do to everybody.
I was not flattering you when I said how rich your presentation was. I need to re-watch it and to reread parts of your book. I want to thank you so much. I'll get to a formal thanks at the end here of a little series. I want to remind people to check bookshopwestportal.com, no spaces in that URL, bookshopwestportal.com, to purchase Dr. Clark's new book. and to learn about the future bookshop events. Also, please visit wonderfest.org to learn about future Wonderfest events and perhaps to contribute to Wonderfest's nonprofit mission of science outreach. I end this afternoon, or for you, Dr. Clark, this evening, by offering 4 big thank yous. First, to BookShop West Portal for bringing Dr. Clark to us. Second, to our Zoom audience. Thank you for being here. And third, to Wonderfest donors and patrons. And of course, number 4, to the author of The Experience Machine, How Minds Predict and Shape Reality, Dr. Andy Clark. Please join
Thank
me
you.
for perhaps an American Sign Language round of inaudible applause here.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
Dr. Clark. Good afternoon to our Zoomers here, and good evening to you, Dr. Clark. Bye-bye.